Everybody, a little bit late with a bit confusion as befitting philosophers. Chris, did you also?
Next door,
yeah.
These aren't my people.
No. We wanted to take both rooms in some applied ethics imperialism, but thank you for sticking with us. Delighted to host our very own Professor Larry Kaye on AI and our capacities for mind reading. Larry is versed in the philosophy of mind and cognitive psychology, has his PhD from MIT, a bunch of publications in the philosophy of mind, a wonderful book from 2005 on Kant's critique of pure reason. Larry's talk today is facilitated by our Dean's program to provide one course release for promoting publication on AI as part of the AI and Experience project. So I'm happy that worked out. You'll have to forgive me, I'll have to leave a little bit after 1 because the Jewish holiday is responsible for making my childcare fall apart. But at least I get to hear most of the argument, and I will leave you in the capable hands of Dan Feldman, who will replace my monotone voice with his and adjudicating the conversation. So without further ado, Larry.
Thank you for coming. I'm going to alternate between reading what I have here and then talking through parts of it. Artificial intelligence is part of the daily lives of many of us, primarily in the form of global positioning systems, GPS, and digital assistants such as Siri or Alexa, and there are more and more AI technologies becoming available all the time. We semantically interpret the linguistic outputs of these devices in the same way that we interpret human speech. So your GPS says turn left, you same as when a human says that, you interpret that to mean turn left. In the process, though, we often attribute beliefs, desires, and other so-called propositional attitudes to these systems. By the way, the propositional attitude label may come from Russell, but dates back about a century, believes that P, desires that P, thinks that P, where you put in any sentence for P. And so that's, and if you think, you had the idea that a meaningful sentence or statement is a proposition, which you may not, but still that's where the label comes from. So it's maybe not the greatest label. I'll sometimes just say beliefs and desires, but meaning in related states. So here are some, these are just off-the-cuff examples. So the GPS wants me to turn left. The GPS thinks or believes or knows that I want to go to Main Street. Siri is trying to get my attention. She wants to remind me of an appointment. Alexa thought that I said Barry when I said very. Siri thinks, believes, knows that I want to be informed of the Red Sox score. So those are, I'll call those shallow attributions because they don't get very deep into psychological states. But sometimes we get a bit more sophisticated. So the GPS thinks I prefer or desires to send me on the shortest route above all else. Moves away from immediate outputs. Siri knows that I like Indian food. Alexa wants me to make most of my purchases from Amazon. Paranoid attribution, but probably accurate. Most of these attributions are made spontaneously without conscious contemplation. That is, we usually do not ponder what beliefs and desires our AI devices have. We simply attribute attitudes in the course of our interactions with them. However, those in the second group, the last 3, might result from rumination about the device. I have to mention part of what was responsible and inspired this. A few years ago, someone gave me a ride across town and inevitably got lost trying to find her way, which, even though she's, I think, a Boston native. And we were having a conversation which kept getting interrupted because she kept getting into a one-sided argument with her GPS. And she would, and this happens, I think, a fair amount, especially in Boston, where she would say, you're sending me in circles. Are you trying to send me in circles? And you know where I want to go. Why are you telling me this? And the same as you might argue with someone, a human, that you think was not giving you the best of directions. Right? This happened to be someone who's not, I think, not college educated, but then I noticed later on one of my fellow higher educated and really us overeducated people in his Prius would also, he would refer to it usually as a device and it, but then he would sometimes lapse into belief, desire, attributions as well. So I think it varies in the population, and really none of that matters, just the fact that many people spontaneously do it is really the data here. These are the same sorts of attitude attributions that we make for fellow humans, albeit in a much more limited range, both in interpreting their utterances and predicting future utterances. And for humans, future behavior; for AI, just future verbal outputs, linguistic outputs. And this is, in a sense, not surprising, since these systems are programmed to provide outputs that are similar to human speech. So if a human says turn left, you automatically think they want me to turn left. So that's, for that particular example, it would be very surprising, actually, maybe, if we didn't do that. However, it's not as though we are duplicating actual human attributions. As with most of our human interactions, many attributions are novel. Again, if the example I gave of the woman getting into an argument with her GPS, that was something that, probably the first time in her life she ever thought through the details of those particular precise mental states, beliefs and desires she was attributing to her GPS. Our AI attributions are both simpler and more limited than our human attributions, and this is readily explained by the limitations of the systems. Current AI systems that are in widespread use do not have general perceptual abilities. Their verbal outputs are programmed to be affectively neutral. In other words, they provide no basis for the attribution of emotional states, and they lack sophisticated reasoning ability. As a result of these limitations, users have no basis for attributing emotional, affective, or any other conscious states to their AI devices, or perceptual beliefs, or sophisticated chains of reasoning. In other words, the capacities and outputs of our current AI invite only relatively simple attitude attributions and that we do assign. The capacity to attribute mental states to fellow humans has been dubbed mind reading. I think that label came about 25, maybe 30 years ago in both the psychological and philosophical literature. So, and we'll get into that a bit in a few minutes. So we may say that we may also say that we are readily mind reading our AI systems in a very limited way. The question that arises here is if users really think that these devices have attitudes. Would most users insist that the above attributions are really true, excuse me, or would they, on reflection, adopt some sort of instrumentalism? My GPS, of course, doesn't really want anything. I'm just talking that way. And again, the second friend I cited, I assume he would, on reflection, say something like that. I'm not sure about other people. And actually, let me mention, I think we'll come back to this near the end of the talk, but an interesting, this is just maybe a step away from anecdotal. For years, I've been doing a philosophy of mind unit in my intro to philosophy class, and then also in one other class, and I survey my students to see if they believe that AI can think. And up until, I've been here quite a while, in the mid to late 90s, the answer was just overwhelmingly no, like a no-brainer no. And I remember there's one or two exceptions where the unfortunate student who insisted, yeah, I've been to the whatever, see the new technology, and we have built intelligent machines, and they got laughed at, unfortunately. Students can unfortunately be mean from time to time. The last couple years I did it and I do sophisticated philosophy of mind, at least sophisticated enough where I've distinguished between being conscious and then having beliefs and desires and pointing out they might be separate. And so I maybe have primed the intuitions a bit, but about half the students with opinions thought that their AI systems really do have beliefs and desires. Because again, they are spontaneously attributing some beliefs and desires to them. I think just one or two students actually then also claim that AI is conscious, but again, that's a minority opinion. So that suggests, and again, it'd be interesting to study this large scale, but I've seen, at least in my sample groups, a shift of thinking. And again, we had really relatively simplistic AI for several decades, and suddenly things have really taken off. And but still, you might not expect that to change the thinking about such systems, especially if we still think they're not conscious. So while I suggest that it might be interesting to conduct studies, the data here for the talk is just that we readily make such attributions, whatever we decide about whether the systems really have beliefs and desires or not. And I'll come back to that much later in the talk. And this is here's I think an important point. Our behavior in this regard is much different from truly fictional attributions, such as when we sometimes say things about inanimate objects. Famous classic one is the sun is trying to peek out from behind the clouds. But I really, really doubt you could find anyone who would think that the sun really has intentions, right? It's really desires to do anything. So in what follows, we will consider several consequences of our mind-reading AI. First, what this tells us about our mind-reading abilities. And so we'll get into the theorizing about them, and I'll draw a fairly strong conclusion. There's also a bit about how what this tells us about our content attributions, and really what mental content is, which is a huge issue in language, philosophy of language and mind. And finally, how widespread AI interaction may affect our mind-reading abilities themselves. So our human mind-reading abilities, our abilities to readily attribute mental states to fellow humans in daily life, have been the subject of both empirical theorizing and philosophical analysis dating back over 4 decades. So I will now argue that our attributions to AI provide useful data for evaluating these accounts. We will begin by narrowing the focus. While the first wave of attempted explanation focused on developmental issues, that's where the whole mind-reading conception came out of, where in I think the mid to late 70s, one or another cognitive psychologist pointed out that it looks like, I forget, it was apes or monkeys are assigning mental states to others, and then wondered if it was innate and in our genes as well, and then suggestions that we might have innate. And sometime not long after that, I think it got dubbed mind reading, whether or not we might have innate mind reading abilities. And then there's a ton of work looking at young children and at what point they start attributing beliefs and desires to other people, and how that affects. There's a famous experiment where if the experimenter hides an object, like hides a ball under a cube or something like that, and there's a second witness to it, who is then not in the room so sees the ball and then is taken out of the room and is brought back in. And very young children will predict that the witness will look under the box for the ball, because they are seemingly self-centered and don't realize yet that there may be different beliefs and desires, different knowledge in the other person. But at a fairly early age, 3 or 4, it changes, and then they predict, no, they don't know where it is. I know where it is, and you know where it is, the experimenter, but not that other person. So just a ton of focus on that whole paradigm. That was largely the 80s look at mind reading. It's full of that discussion, primarily in psychology. And then philosophers entered as well, more or less gradually, especially into the 90s. And last decade, I'll mention several of them now. Although a variety of explanations of mind reading have been offered, the 2 dominant accounts are the so-called theory, one of our philosophical terrible names, but there it is, and the simulation account. So the theory view maintains that each of us has a knowledge or a theory of common sense folk psychology. Paradigmatically, this is thought to consist of concepts of psychological states, such as belief, desire, happiness, fear, so on, a set of criteria for determining when a person is in one of those states. So if someone says P, then ceteris paribus, all things being equal, they believe that P, and generalizations about the interrelations of these states. For instance, if A strongly desires X and also believes that Y is the best course of action to achieve X, then ceteris paribus, A will develop an intention to do Y. The theory theorist claims that our attributions to other people consist in applying various aspects of this theoretical apparatus. A seemingly sharply contrasting view is the simulation account. And I'll just mention Gordon and Goldman as the two main people who I'm about to pick on, and both philosophers who've been the primary defenders of this view, which is typically motivated by the idea that attributions can be explained in a much simpler way that avoids the postulation of an elaborate theoretical framework. Simulationists claim that we use relevant observed facts about another person, including previously attributed mental states, to imitate their situation in ourselves, thus simulating their psychological status. Running a simulation reveals the apparent mental states that are attributed to the target person. For instance, this is a very typical example. You see person A says something to person B, and you think, if that had been said to me, I would feel very hurt and insulted. So you then, according to the simulation view, immediately attribute those states to the other person, and then you look to see how their facial expressions and how they're behaving to get more data, and go from there. It may seem that there is a substantial difference between these two views, one that could be decided by introspecting about how we are carrying out our attributions. In particular, we might think that if the theory view is correct, I'm just going to start calling it the theory view rather than the theory view, then we should be aware of making our attributions by theorizing. And we typically have no such awareness. However, some defenders of the theory approach, Stitch and Nichols were one of the big ones, and dating back to Jerry Fodor in the 60s, who was the primary, I actually got to study with him for a couple of years at his final days at MIT, and he was one of the leading critics of behaviorism and defenders of functionalism instead. And the theory is essentially the idea that in ordinary life we are functionalists and we attribute beliefs and desires based on having a background functionalist theory. We'll come back to that a bit. However, it's also been suggested by Goldman that simulation mind reading may often be non-conscious. So we should not expect to decide between these counts via introspection. And I'll just point out, as I mentioned earlier, so just looking at me doing that, many of you had spontaneous attributions of what's going on in me psychologically, and notice, I assume you were not consciously theorizing or consciously aware that you were running a simulation of me. You just got a few ideas about what might be going on in me, right? So that's also, I think, what happens with AI. People don't think, okay, because my GPS had such and such an output, therefore they must have such and such beliefs and desires. We just, throw out the attributions. So there really is a problem about how to decide what would be data to decide between the two views. Another suggestion is that if the simulation view is correct, then the attribution process will turn out to be informationally encapsulated, famous word from psychological and philosophy, actually from Fodor again, theorizing about the structure of our minds and brains, meaning that they operate in relative informational isolation from other processes, including general beliefs, since on this count we are not using our general belief set to generate attributions. By contrast, defenders of the theory view in developmental psychology have postulated that our folk psychological theory is comparable to scientific theorizing. Wellman in 1990, and then 10 years later, another group of, I think, partly some of her students. And I think that's been an unfortunate turn for the theory, because, and if that were true, since scientific theorizing is largely conscious, or scientists spend a lot of conscious time thinking about their theories and developing them. That seems to predict falsely that our belief and desire attributions should be introspectively a matter of explicit theorizing. It has thus been suggested that for the theory view as opposed to simulation, our mind reading abilities should be sensitive to what we generally believe and learn, the rest of our theoretical beliefs, and that it's not and this might appear to be a prominent difference between these two accounts. However, the realm of propositional attitude explanation seems to be relatively self-contained. And this is what lends plausibility to the idea that there is a body of folk psychological theory. And again, dating back to Fodor, that there is a sort of tight realm of belief, desire, explanation that seems independent of many of our other psychological abilities. And so, excuse me, not surprisingly, a folk psychological theory module has been proposed, actually by someone I went to grad school with who also studied under Fodor. And actually one of the latest versions of the theory from last decade proposes a lot of mini modules. And so modules are self-contained units. Other examples of supposed modules in our cognitive makeup fairly early on in vision, so you get very surprisingly limited data from the retina is transmitted to the brain, and so you're trying to construct a representation of the environment. And so one of the first things you want to identify is assuming that you're getting physical objects where the edges are. So it's been postulated there is a specialized process early in vision that's an edge detector and just does that and nothing else, and does that apart from anything else going on. It looks like facial recognition is similar, in part because with selective brain damage, you can lose that and then everything else is fine. You're still perceiving the world, you're still perceiving people, you just can't for the life of you recognize even your closest relatives and friends. And that again seems to be a specific processing device, and there are actually a number, at least one prominent philosopher has been pushing the view for about 20 years now that he calls massive modularity, that it's all that way. And I think there are some worries about that, but still it looks like belief desire psychology is a self-contained realm that could be, as I say, part of a module, or consists primarily in a modular psychological ability. So while the simulation and the theory approach look to be different, it has been very difficult to find definitive differences in what the two types of models predict. So look, in some mythical future where we have a true, full, complete, or on the road to really true, complete theoretical psychological knowledge of the brain, then it looks like we're predicting two very different types of processes. Right? One where we run a simulation of the target person or thing we're assigning beliefs to, and the other where we call up our theory and apply it in various ways, draw inferences. So it has been suggested in the mid-90s that perhaps there is no real evidential difference between the views, always a bad thing in philosophy. However, we'll now see that our present considerations drive a wedge between these accounts, and that's why I think this is really interesting, because as far as I can see, debate between the two views stalled out about 15 years ago, so here's actually some new data to think about. That's first main part of my paper here. Since simulation views appear to fail for AI mind reading, as I'll now argue, whereas our AI attributions are strongly consistent with the theory approach. So we'll consider the primary versions of the simulation view, beginning with the most extreme. Gordon has put out a view he calls radical simulationism, and he wants to avoid appeals to either analogy or introspection, so he instead explains attributing a mental state to another person by imagining being that person. And here's a quote from him. He doesn't actually ever really summarize his view, he just presents a number of examples, and so here's the primary one. So there is a guy named Mr. Tees, T-E-E-S. I don't know what that's supposed to refer to exactly. But to simulate Mr. T's in this situation that he's thinking about requires an egocentric shift, a recentering of my egocentric map to Mr. T's. He becomes, in my imagination, the referent of the first person pronoun. So I, RMG, Robert M. Gordon, cease to be the referent of the first person pronoun. Such recentering is a prelude to transforming myself in imagination into Mr. T's as much as actors become the characters they play. And so his claim is, in ordinary life, when we attribute beliefs and desires and related attitudes to other people, that is what we are doing. So applying this count, when we attribute attitudes to AI, we are imagining being those systems. But that is absurd, especially go down to GPS. None of us have the slightest idea what, if anything, it would be like to be an AI system, so the suggested pronoun reference shift is simply not possible. It's false that I attribute beliefs and desires to AI systems by asking myself, if I were this GPS or digital assistant, what would I be thinking? But that's what Gordon's view straight out predicts. By the way, as philosophers generally want to avoid making empirical predictions, because of that, you can actually have your view refuted. We survived for centuries and millennia, I think, by avoiding that. And that's the problem, too, with dabbling in empirical psychology. Note that there's no wiggle room here. Gordon wants to avoid the idea that I ask myself what mental states I would have in the relevant situation, and then by analogy ascribe them to another, in this case an AI system. We'll look at an alternative simulation view in a moment that does do that. Nor would it work to claim that I simulate what a generic human would think in the relevant situation, since that would similarly require an inference via analogy, and really you're into the realm of theorizing there. So theorizing about what attitudes humans generally have, and then transferring that to AI devices. And so, in other words, we would, on that view, come up with the result something like someone in circumstances X, Y, Z normally believes and desires A, B, C, and so we'd have a theory there, contrary to that's the opposing view that Gordon wants to avoid at all costs. Perhaps Gordon could attempt to respond that when we attribute attitudes to AI, we are not using our normal methods of mind reading. However, very simple linguistic exchanges with fellow humans readily duplicate AI utterances. By the way, this is another just interesting side issue. If I'm driving the wrong way on a one-way street and my GPS tells me you're going the wrong way on a one-way street, I may attribute to the GPS the belief that I'm going the wrong way, along with the desire to inform me of this, in exactly the same way I will if a human stranger yells this out at me. Right? I'll probably attribute much more to the stranger, but again, well, they'll probably have an emotional tone to their voice and the like. So, but still, the basic attitude attributions work the same. And again, quickly and unconsciously, right? You don't, especially in a situation like that, you don't stop to theorize about whether your AI really has beliefs and desires or not. If my digital assistant tells me that something is on sale, inevitably what most of our digital assistants do, I assume it wants me to consider buying it, just as I will if I receive an email from a human. And here's the thing that I think territory we're entering into. For that matter, if I discover that the supposed human sender is actually an AI device, I may well maintain this desire attribution. And generally, as AI becomes more and more complexly woven into our lives, we often find that we are not sure if we are communicating with a live human or some sort of digital system. And I think that's going to grow and grow. Robocalls, I think, are nothing compared to, they're still, I think, mostly pre-recorded, but we may unfortunately be receiving calls like that from digital agents in the relatively near future. But this does not prevent attitude attributions. So there's no basis for claiming that there is some sort of principal difference in psychological processes between human versus AI mind reading. So another prominent simulationist, Goldman, and he wrote a lengthy book defending simulationism in 2006. Along with Gordon, thus the other leading simulationist. He has a somewhat, I guess, more prominent, but certainly more complicated version of the simulationist approach to mind reading that involves a multi-stage process. On this model, in order to attribute mental states, including beliefs and desires, we begin by imagining that we have engaged in the behavior of the target person. Such imagination puts the attributor in relevant mental states, which according to Goldman, we become aware of by introspecting. And then we attribute these states to the other person. With AI, the first stage will involve imagining that we have uttered the AI's verbal outputs, since that's all that's available, and of course no other facial expressions or behaviors. So to take a simple example, again, if the GPS says turn left here, then by Goldman's account, I imagine that I said that, which causes me to introspectively be aware that in making such an inference, I would have the belief that the driver should turn left, along with the desire to inform the driver to turn left. And then I project that onto the AI device. However, here's the obvious problem with excuse me, that view applied to AI. Human psychology involves a vast, complex array of mental states, even for a simple example like this. And in previous examples, I've already really hinted at this. Thus, if I tell a driver to turn left, I will normally have the intention of helping them to get to their destination via the best possible route. I don't think we would actually attribute that to an AI device, though. You can actually, at the end of the talk, I'd be happy to hear your anecdotal accounts of what we do or don't attribute to AI devices. And we're just an obvious step further. Suppose the GPS tells me to turn left, but I do not. It will likely tell me to take the next left available and keep on doing that if I have decided not to go left. However, a typical human will react to the situation by becoming miffed or frustrated with the driver for not following their instructions, and if this occurs several times, may perhaps refuse to give any further advice. I know when my help is not wanted, right? And may even start to lose some respect for the driver, and imagination and introspection, as you're now doing, obviously reveal that. So we don't assign any such attitudes to a GPS, and it's not as though we start to and then consciously cut down, oh no, I realize my GPS is probably not actually miffed at me, and so on. We just, again, assign a relatively simple layer of beliefs and attitudes. And to return to another example, were I to have a strong desire to get someone to buy more products from Amazon, I would normally have a sophisticated set of reasons for maintaining this desire. For instance, I have evaluated the competing ways of getting products and have found Amazon to be the best option, and so on. But we don't assign elaborate reasons to our AI systems. Actually, there's a point at which we immediately get into that's how it was programmed. Right, so we just assume that the Bezos empire programs its AI that way, right? And that's sort of the background assumption, which is not a belief, desire, attribution, but then relative to that, we are willing to assign beliefs and desires. It's a little bit like at a certain point we can appeal to human nature, or if you're a nativist, as I think you should be, right? That's, as it were, just built into our brains or minds, and so kind of similar, although it comes very quick with our still relatively simplistic AI systems. So Goldman's model fails to explain the minimalistic level of attitudes that we spontaneously attribute to AI and why we stop there. Perhaps he could claim that we generate much more complex attributions and then trim them down, but there's no evidence that this is occurring in binary AI. We do not experience any such conscious diminutions. And his view is explicitly introspective, so introspection should tell us that we are generating all sorts of human complex attitudes when we think of AI and then trimming them down. Or Goldman might suggest that in setting the parameters for imagination, we limit the consequences to relatively simple attitudes without any effective or otherwise conscious state. Again, that would have to be something our brains are doing fairly elaborately and unconsciously. But this is a substantial bit of theorizing that, again, does not jive with already seemingly automatic attributions of simple attitudes to AI. Nor, by the way, is there any clear demarcation about potential complexity, since intentions such as recommend products that share significant features with past purchases. We're happy to attribute that desire to say, Siri or Alexa, but that's sophisticated. That's fairly abstract, at an abstract level away from immediate outputs. Or indicate the shortest route unless it involves a lot of stoplights or is likely to be heavily trafficked. A plausible attribution of intentions to a GPS system. And those aren't particularly simple, and they're connected to outputs in fairly complex ways. So if you trim things way, way down, you will, again, make a false prediction about what people are actually willing to attribute. Moreover, it's not clear that we have the ability to imagine, given a specification of utterances, a limited domain of mental states. And this is similar to the problem for Gordon's view. It's not plausible that we can generate attributions by imagining being an AI system with no consciousness or perception and with very limited reasoning abilities. And we can appreciate this overall problem that I'm raising for AI attributions relative to the simulationist view by considering an explanation offered by, I think it's Barlacina and Gordon. This is just 2 years ago on the Stanford Philosophy webpage under this simulation view, or whatever it's titled, of what counts as a simulation. So according to what they call their RES plus REU model, a mental state is in an attributor is a simulation of a target mental state in another if it is generated by a cognitive process that is an instance of a type of cognitive mechanism that counts as a reuse of the same type of cognitive mechanism in the target. That is, the model requires that the target has the same type of cognitive mechanisms as the attributor, including instances of specific processes that correspond to the processes that are used to generate the simulated mental state. But this is false for AI systems. Our beliefs are formed via human beliefs are formed via belief fixation processes that involve something like the general mechanism of the human language faculty, human propositional memory, and interaction with very complicated perceptual processes. But we know that current AI systems lack all of these complex components of human psychology. We at least know enough about human psychology to know it's not there in AI systems. In other words, when we attribute beliefs and desires to AI, there's seemingly no basis for thinking that we're attributing or otherwise assuming a substantial psychological similarity with humans. However, we can maybe find a way of saving that. However, it will support the opposition view. Perhaps a simulationist can argue that simulation can correspond to the psychology of AI systems in a very, very abstract way. Thus, if a cognitive system, human or otherwise, says that the answer is P, then cateris paribus, the system believes that P is the answer. And if a system says do Q, then cateris paribus, the system both desires and intends to form the audience to do Q. However, such psychological attributions completely abstract away from the causal processes that produce these beliefs and desires, again, contrary to that model just read you, when we're considering what we're considering amounts to a relatively simple version of a functionalist understanding of mentality that predicts and explains behavior via attributions of a causal pattern of inner states that are also causally connected to input and output. That is Fodor's characterization of functionalism general from 40 years ago. Functionalism, of course, allows for completely different constitutions and different instances of cognitive systems. So famously, what you're made out of is not relevant to the truth of functionalist psychology. It's just the inner causal pattern. And functionalist explanations, as Fodor made clear throughout his career, can also consist of specific psychological processes and mechanisms. So generally, at least on, for instance, Fodor's view, and I think a number of other similar functionalist philosophers, information processing explanations in cognitive science, cognitive psychology, are all functionalists, all functionalist based. And so generally, if you're talking about information, it doesn't matter what kind of device or being is realizing the information and the relations to the information. That's the basic idea of functionalism. And what we're now looking at is the idea of abstracting away from any specific mechanisms altogether. So you can have back to one of my previous examples, if we figure out exactly how human brains manage to be edge detectors, right? Then we can program it into an AI system, which will not be a living brain, and it will be constituted differently. But if we succeed, then the device will be detecting edges in an abstract sense, informational sense, the same way we are. So that's where we've gotten to with what we're doing with AI. So the suggestion that with AI we are operating with attributions that abstract away from all of the details of human psychology would thus require that simulation can generate functionalist attributions and explanations. But this is dubious. So if a GPS says turn left, I can imagine what psychological states a human who said this would have, either more or less directly according to Gordon's account or via targeted pretense and introspection according to Goldman. But either way, this would then require very sophisticated theoretic pruning to get to a level of purely functionalist attributions. That is, both imagination and introspection of our own psychological states yield a complex array of human psychological states. So we have, as we've considered above for Goldman's view, so the crux of the problem for the simulation view is that moving from attributions of complex human psychology to simplified purely functionalist attributions would itself be a matter of, would not itself be a matter of simulation, but rather of theorizing. So the point I've taken you to is really, again, the opposing view. We're just looking at functionalist theory flat out and why I think simulation matters at all. And so the examples I've been giving you of AI attribution just look to me like straight up functionalist theorizing. We have no idea, especially most users have no idea what kind of programming went into the AI device. So they're not, including like my highly knowledgeable friend who actually is an architect, he knows nothing about computer programming. And so as he starts to get away from talking about the outputs of the device, then he shifts into good old belief desire psychology and seemingly, I would now say, functionalist theorizing. So this doesn't positively prove that we are theorizing when we're interacting with AI, but I think that is by far the best explanation available. And I don't think that this, what we've been considering, shows that simulation plays no role at all in mental state attribution. AI mind reading at present only concerns the attitudes, thus allowing for the view that other types of mental states, the affective, perhaps conscious states in general, are attributed to humans via simulation. So that would be somewhat of a retreat for the simulation view. It would also be possible to endorse a mixed view of attitude attribution. And we do sometimes consciously engage in simulation of others' attitudes. For example, when a detective trying to track down a thief asks himself, if I were a criminal who had just pulled off a heist, what would I be planning to do next? And Goldman does endorse a hybrid account, but he maintains that simulation is the default procedure. I'm now suggesting the reverse is true, that theorizing is the default procedure, and maybe we sometimes simulate on top of that. And Goldman also distinguishes between low-level and high-level simulation, with affective states being the prime member of the low-level category and mental and motor imagery. High-level, his reasons for classifying such attributions as high-level is that they involve complexity, can be subject to voluntary control, and at least are partially accessible to consciousness. However, current AI mind reading involves relatively simple attributions that are typically done spontaneously rather than deliberately, and are usually not the result of conscious contemplation. So I think it is very much exhibiting our low-level belief, desire, attributions, mind reading skills. We have just considered that such attributions appear to involve theory rather than simulation, so we might hypothesize in somewhat the reverse of Goldman's view that our ordinary attitude attributions are based on low-level applications of basic theoretical understanding of attitude psychology, and that high-level ascriptions that involve some combination of complex voluntary and conscious states may sometimes involve simulation. However, it's worth noting that even then, theory may be a primary factor. So in our example, the detective might infer that if he were a thief, he would likely intend to seek out a fence based on the theoretical generalizations that thieves usually want to convert their loot to spendable cash, and that thieves often use fences to achieve this, together with, bring this principle back in, the perhaps general tacit belief desire principle that if A strongly desires X and also believes Y is the best course of action to achieve it, then cateris paribus, A will develop the intention to do so. So it looks like an instantiation of that principle, and then you draw the consequence. So AI mind reading thus appears to be revealing attitude attributions at its simplest, apart from the complexities of our fellow human psychologies and behavior. And I have to say, I really spent a lot of time in the mind reading literature and working this up, and just, that's a huge problem because you attribute a conscious state to someone else. Then you're immediately into a realm of other complex, seemingly inferences or simulations. Who knows about what else is going on in them in terms of other emotional states and beliefs and desires and the like. So here we go. We want science, right? Probably, even though these are philosophers. So we want to have, take stuff into the lab and break it down to its simplest. So I think that's what we accidentally have with our relatively simplistic AI devices. And again, they look to be revealing that we're not running simulations. Thus, we've been taught many things about human psychology, both inside and outside of academics, and who knows how that interacts with our attributions to one another in daily life. But no one's instructed in AI psychology, or to put it another way, most AI users have no knowledge of the programs that their systems are running. So we have been given an interest and opportunity to examine a fairly pure application of our most primitive attitude mind reading abilities, and as we have just considered, these abilities do not look to be simulationists, but rather appear to be based on functionalist theorizing. So I have two more types of consequences to draw, but that was the longer one, and sorry for, I assume few, if any of you, are familiar with the mind reading literature, but now you are a bit. And like I say, I find this really interesting because it looks like 15 years ago or even 20 years ago, it was kind of the competing views kind of acknowledged we're running out of relevant data to evaluate these views. And like I say, I really think AI mind reading counts heavily against the simulationist view. Also, here's another territory most of you are not familiar with. What is meaning? What is content in general? In, philosophy of language, philosophy of mind. And actually, I'll get into that by considering this other question. Let us return to the question of whether or not AI systems may truly have the attitudes that we attribute to them. Actually, let's discuss this a bit, and then I'll tell you where I'm going with this. So I'll give you three choices. AI systems do truly have some beliefs and desires. No, they definitely don't have any, or not sure. And again, you're no longer good unprimed subjects talking through this. So survey, how many think AI systems really do have beliefs and desires? No one willing to go there. How many think they definitely do not? Anyone not sure? Okay. For those of you who say definitely not, I'll give you two choices. Is it because they are seemingly not conscious? Anyone?
What's the other option? Yeah, what's the other?
They don't have living brains.
First one.
The conscious? Yeah. And so I'm going to turn into Jerry Fodor for a moment, or maybe William Lycan, that if you understand functionalism, those aren't good reasons. So generally, having a belief or desire is connected with what you say and how you behave, and is related to other inner states, beliefs and desires, but doesn't have to be a part of consciousness, seemingly. And there's been at least one prominent philosopher defending this view for the past few years. Do you have conscious knowledge of your own beliefs and desires? Like, can you consciously experience beliefs and desires? You can consciously think about what you might believe and desire, and like sort of consciously theorize about yourself, but that's not the same as actually being aware of what you believe or what you want. So Carruthers is the guy who's argued that. If you're making that assumption kind of naively, then okay, you need consciousness to have beliefs and desires, but if you start contemplating that you may not need consciousness to have beliefs and desires, does that make it more reasonable to attribute them? So just keep thinking about that. But I'm going to switch to the content issue because there's also an interesting and surprising point there. We know that current AI both does not have most human psychological processes and abilities, and also supports an extremely simple set of attitude ascriptions. By contrast, the desire to inform someone of P is part of a much more complicated psychology in humans. So the complexity involves both a lot more and more sophisticated attitudes, but also a large array of conscious states, including both perceptual and affective states. So since the beliefs and desires we attribute to AI do not stand in these complex relations to these other psychological states, we might again be led to assert that AI does not have psychological states at all. So seemingly, if to tell someone you have to turn left, you have to have sophisticated knowledge of cars and roads and the like, and that's, you know, all in the background, certainly for humans, and AI doesn't have that, so that could be a reason for, and similar concerns for not attributing them. However, as we noted at the outset, our attributions to AI often result in successful predictions of further outputs. That's really, really important here. That why are people making them, especially as we generalize a bit? My GPS wants to provide me with the shortest route no matter what. That predicts a lot of future outputs from the system. In the same way that if we, you know, you assign general whatever, you assign jealousy to someone and then predict a lot of future behaviors on their part as a result. So we might say that these systems really have AI attitudes, thus amounting to a functionalist abstraction away from much of the complexity and most of the processes of human psychology. So I guess I'm trying to convince you of that part. And I'm shifting the intuition back and forth, yes or no, do they really have beliefs and desires? So I'll shift the intuition back to the negative again by considering the question of mental content. Content, meaning, if I tell my digital assistant I want to buy a cotton shirt, does it form the belief that I want to buy a cotton shirt? Here, details about processing become all important if the input is processed wholly separately from one with similar content. So if I say I want to buy a silk shirt, that's a completely independent set of processing. Learning that would probably be inclined to shift us away from attributing a belief and just think we're behaving purely in an instrumental way toward the outputs. However, if the system has syntactic compositionality and thus perhaps semantic compositionality, so if all inputs involving a given term such as shirt are treated in a similar manner, then a specific set of inner states with a specific set of inner states corresponding to this input, then the case for content becomes more plausible. So we are edging toward the idea of concepts. Actually, that is my thing in philosophy, and it's been a real, both philosophers and psychologists have struggled, philosophers over forever to explain concepts, and psychologists since the 70s. And so we're going to bring in the two leading views on that issue as well. So believing that someone wants to buy a cotton shirt requires possession and application of the concepts agent, desire, buy, cotton, and shirt. And we'll just focus on the last two, cotton and shirt. So can present AI possess these concepts? We receive an immediate negative answer if we adopt a causal correspondence view of concepts and content, such as Fodor. So Fodor is the hero in the previous section. Now he's the villain, I guess. Or it's not like everything he said is correct. So this account requires that the system be able to token a type of representation in the presence of the kind. So token a shirt token in the presence of shirts and a cotton token in the presence of cotton. This appears to entail that non-perceptual devices, including most current AI, cannot possibly have concepts. Just end of story. Non-perceptual, you don't get the perceptual tokening, so no concepts. So the causal correspondence account suggests that we are falsely projecting human content onto our AI systems. And again, philosophy being what it is, Fodor's unfortunately no longer around, but you know, there'd probably be elaborate considerations about how he could possibly try to get out of that, but still, just given the actual account, just flat out, no meaning there. However, again, we need to consider that our ascriptions of attitudes with content to AI often result in successful predictions of further outputs, again, which makes it plausible that they are true ascriptions. And this suggests that we are applying a notion of content that is not radically falsified by the makeup of these systems. There's an alternative view, the inferential or functional role view from both Bloch and Brandom. One of my colleagues who's not here is very interested in the Brandom view, which maintains that content is constituted by inferential or other functional relations amongst internal states. Suppose, as is likely, an AI system will infer from I want to buy a cotton shirt, or the user wants to buy a cotton shirt, to I want to buy a silk shirt, to the user wants to buy a shirt in general, and perhaps inferring from Our user wants to buy clothing, or inferring from I want to buy a cotton shirt to the user has a preference for cotton. So those are inferential relations between those notions. Yeah.
How
Okay.
close you are, but we're way out of time now.
Oh, sorry. I wasn't given any idea of time or the like, and I did actually started late. So, okay. Here we have something that a pale imitation. That's a pale imitation of much more complicated inferential relations found in humans. And even this modest structure may be sufficient to make it plausible that some sort of content really is present. So oddly enough, I have to say that thinking about AI attributions, it looks like we are not, that the perceptual-based perceptual-based view of content is not at all what's behind when we attribute content to AI, but the inferential view looks a bit plausible. So that looks like maybe that is the overall correct account of mental content. And I'll just briefly talk through the last section, which is just wildly speculative anyway, but look, and it's the dark implication here. So AI is becoming a big part of many lives, and especially with kids, for several generations, TV was the babysitter for kids, but now AI devices are becoming that. And I'm not sure exactly what happens with TV. I guess you are being presented with model humans and utterances and the like, so maybe that's part of language learning. Probably okay, because it's more or less normal people on TV, more or less. AI devices are seemingly, for many kids, now a major part of their modeling for mind reading, but it's really limited mind reading. So, and maybe human mind reading abilities are all innate. And there are the nativists around in cognitive psychology, but if not, then it's possible that having limited interaction with normal humans and more interaction with AI, you will degrade the mind reading abilities of those kids, and in particular, right, they won't experience sophisticated reasoning, which we often spend time neurotically worrying about what another person is thinking of us, and just go on, and that's really not feasible for AI. So, but that can be good too. You can make elaborate predictions about how someone is going to behave based on very complex attitude ascriptions that aren't really deeply rooted in behavior. And I'll just note this, I'll connect with ethics. I'm surprised fewer people have mentioned this. I haven't trouble finding anyone saying this. Our digital systems are almost all very friendly, compliant, obedient female voices. So if you raise kids with a major role model of, women's voice, you expect obedient compliance, whereas perhaps with a man's voice, right, there you're going to get conflict and disagreement and the like. And that's, obviously morally ugly. But yet that's been going on for quite a while, and I don't know. I think it'd be hard to study AI. Actually, something you mentioned to me, there is apparently empirical data that kids learning to speak language from AI programs are doing less well. And maybe something similar is going on with mind reading abilities, and maybe in fact learning human speech has to come as part in an interaction with mind reading, right, where you're mind reading the speaker and assigning more sophisticated attitudes to them, and thus learning content that way as well, and learning the structure of the language. And so you have a very degraded mind reading model in AI, and maybe that's part of the problem with trying to teach primarily kids who substantially teach language abilities or model language through AI. So, my closing suggestion is this: there's a lot of interesting things to study in regard to, as well as to philosophize about in terms of mind reading AI. So, sorry I went over. Yeah.
Hang on, I did.
I'm not entirely convinced by your distinction between
the simulation and the functionalist account of how we interact with these devices. And it makes me think about the idea that this theory of mind module that we're activating in order to interact with these non-human minds, it goes back to, probably a million years of our evolution, that the origins of religion are looking at a mountain, looking at the wind, the sun, and as you made fun of somebody attributing intentionality, but this is the kind of the basis of our mythologies, that we're thinking about, we're trying to simulate what is it that the mind of the sun is trying to do with me, and how can I propitiate it and get some benefit from it. And likewise with pets. I mean, we misattribute intentionality and emotional, intellectual sophistication to our pets on the basis of very sparse
I have
cues.
to say, I've discussed that with pet owners, and they very much disagree with that.
They disagree that they're doing
a
it?
typical dog owner will go to great lengths to defend the fact that his or her dog has beliefs and desires and give you, right?
Oh, well, I know,
One.
but that's because
Yeah.
they're misattributing. Yeah,
Well,
if you're saying that it can't be good simulation unless you're putting yourself in the same
no.
mental
I think
frame.
that view is false. The argument was that the simulationist view, which is a view of human attribution, is falsified by AI. And you might argue it's also, it's trickier. If I were a dog, what would I do? We can maybe think through that one a little bit, but still,
Okay, but
I think animals are a problem for the simulation view as well.
It seems like there's three things you can say. One is we're not actually trying to simulate the AI's mind, or
Right.
we are trying to simulate
So
the
this-
AI's mind,
here.
and we're not actually able to do it.
Simulationism is a theory about how humans assign beliefs and desires in general.
Right.
So I'm saying how we're behaving in regard to AI falsifies that view, because we are not in any sense simulating our AI devices to come up with attributions to them.
I guess, so again, my response is in the same way, I think that some people probably do attempt to simulate the mind of an AI in the same way that they would simulate, that the superstitious people would simulate the minds of other non-human objects.
What's the basis for saying that?
The people have rather elaborate conversations with their devices sometimes.
I'm defending an alternative account, which is that we, in general, have a theory of folk psychology and apply it to one another, and we are also spontaneously applying that to our AI devices.
Okay. And the folk psychology doesn't involve attempting to attribute a mind that you're trying to simulate.
To attribute.
So when we engage in this folk psychology and treat something that's not human as if it is.
Well, no, I just say I am neutral on the question of whether AI really has beliefs and desires or not. But I think a case can be made that they really do, while lacking consciousness and lacking other human psychological states. So that is different. Actually, functionalism in general is different from the idea of treating something. So you assign beliefs and desires to dogs. I don't think it's correct to say that you're treating them as human. If you assign very, very human beliefs and desires to them, then you are. But
Right.
Okay. My dog thinks I got lost on the freeway or something. Right? No, that's not happening in your dog. But my dog wants food. Yeah.
After you, Chris.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I think this is following up on Jay's question, maybe in a different way. It struck me that all of the arguments against the simulationist view presuppose that people are, in some sense, reasonable and not terribly mistaken when they're making shallow attributions to AI devices. And I'm just not sure that's true. I think people are pretty mistaken in their mind-reading attributions left, right, and center. So, in other words, the argument that you're putting forward depends on your Prius driver, yeah, who really does, as soon as they're conscious about it, they're like, yeah, I'm not actually attributing any complex kind of thing to my GPS, sorry, I'm not making these kinds of mistakes. I'm not assuming that my dog really loves me in a deep and wholehearted way. I'm not assuming that Apple really wants me to get to my destination within the 25 minutes that but I'm not really sure that's true. I mean, that's a very large assumption that's crucial to all of your arguments against the
Even if you're
simulationists.
not doing it with the machine, you might be doing it to Google or to Tesla, because the machine is just your communication device with this larger thing that might be intentional. Right?
That's another interesting thing to think
Yeah.
about. Yeah. But you were moving from the shallow level to more sophisticated level there, and
I actually think that people make quite sophisticated attributions, and you are insisting that with AI they only make shallow attributions.
no.
That's the key to the
the claim is just
anti-simulationist arguments.
Most of them are relatively shallow, not all of them. So, and it's sophisticated, and it's about, again, making attributions that will be useful in predicting future outputs. Same as with humans, right? So if you attribute that my GPS wants to take me on the shortest route no matter what, that predicts a lot of future outputs.
I'm not actually addressing the argument in favor of the functionalist view. I'm addressing your arguments against the simulationist view, and they all seem to depend on the reasonable person who says something like, "Just like the sun doesn't want to burn me today." But in fact, if you look at a lot of human history, people have really thought, I mean, very seriously attributed all kinds of complicated stuff to the sun, that it wants to burn you.
Here's my claim on what the data is. Just in the ordinary process of interacting with their AI devices, people are often making belief desire attributions, just as it were, without thinking about it and without evaluating what that means, because we're mostly not philosophers who don't care about whether AI really has beliefs and desires or not. They're just finding it useful. And so there's that, and then the claim is that it is the same type of thing that we're doing with fellow humans. That there's not an in-principle difference between human telling you, stop, you're going the wrong way, so they have a belief and desire about that, attributing that to your GPS. That's the only data, I think, that matters.
I guess just to touch on those 2 points, it sounds as though the simulation theory is resting upon the assumption that the entity you're ascribing belief and desires to, or what have you, has a mind. And you could be under the false belief that the sun has a mind, and now we know, now that we don't. But
well, I think it's been made specific, the third view I quoted, that it has psychological processes, and seemingly human-like psychological processes.
the machine or the...
Whatever you're attributing.
Whatever
to.
you're right.
So
Yes,
certainly
I'm sorry,
fellow
yes.
humans,
Yes,
and
yes,
I
yes.
think they get into tricky territory with animals, but
Right.
still you can claim animals have somewhat similar,
Right.
some similar psychological processes to us, but I think not at all with AI.
Right. Okay.
So
So
I think
I do understand.
If that is not what's behind attribution, then I think the simulation view is, at least if they're going to defend it, have to go entirely new route.
So my question more properly would be something along the lines of, this has been a subject that's interested me a lot in terms of other non-psychological entities, such as when we say things like Google has a belief. Now we're not talking about my GPS specifically. Now I'm talking about some loosely defined entity which may or may not be made up of individuals who have psychological states, but we tend to attribute psychological states towards the compiled entity, if you will.
Corporations are evil things that
There you
desire
go. Yeah,
exploit
yeah.
us.
Microsoft
Yeah.
wants to take all my money or whatever. I'm curious what you think about propositional attributions like that to.
Well, you can make the functionalist case, maybe, that this very, very abstract functionalist theory is true of them. Can there be cultural? Can there be? Can countries have?
Yeah.
And governments and the like. And again, that was discussed a long time ago in regard to functionalism, and then everyone forgot about it. And
To me, that would be a strong argument against functionalism, because I would think that the thing that I am trying to describe when I say that I have a belief or I want something is largely different than what I would say about my attribution of, say, a corporation wanting something. Or maybe to take even corporation out of it, which may be a little bit of a weird, loose case, if I say the patriarchy wants XYZ, it seems like that's a...
Well, that's easy. You're just drawing an abstract description of what many people collectively want.
Yeah, I'm curious if speakers actually behave in the same way that I wonder if that is actually how speakers behave. Because intellectually, yes, I agree, but I wonder if that's in the same way that speakers behave towards their devices as though they have non-shallow mental states, and on reflection would say they don't. I wonder if we are guilty of the same thing in regards to more abstract entities.
Well, again, I'm trying to remain neutral about whether we can say that anything other than humans really does or doesn't have beliefs and desires. But again, if you go for functionalism, and I guess you could go for functionalism and still try to say no there, but probably then if you adopt a functionalist view of belief and desires in general, then you're going to have to acknowledge that it's possible.
So one of the things that's really interesting to me about this argument, I'm not sure there's a question here, but is the idea that you are using AI as an experimental model for understanding human psychology is, I think, really fascinating and in some ways powerful. So there's this history of sort of every time some kind of AI associated, because we can sort of talk about what does AI actually really even mean, but some kind of AI associated phenomenon happens. So in the early days it was, can the machine beat somebody at playing chess, right? And then eventually it becomes other more sophisticated games and other behaviors like driving a car or interpreting natural language in order to find the best route or whatever it is. People stop thinking it's AI at that point, right? They start saying, no, well, okay, so we haven't actually proven anything about artificial intelligence, and that's led one historian to argue that basically the kinds of tasks that we've used to measure AI, to use as an experimental vehicle for understanding artificial intelligence per se, have been deeply flawed. They haven't been as productive as, say, Drosophila as a model of biological phenomenon. AI hasn't been particularly productive as, these tasks like chess haven't been productive as a model of AI as a research object. And you're taking that and sort of turned it around and used AI as a research object for humans, which I think is really fascinating. Do you see can you expand beyond the attribute belief system and the mind reading, do you think?
Not at the moment, but it depends. Here's one other thing I didn't say. Some people think that AI has hit a plateau again, and that we're kind of stuck at a certain level of complexity and there's no, who knows what will happen in the future. If, however, you get AI that has better reasoning abilities, and then starts to get paranoid scary, right? Because you get out-reasoned by your AI systems and the like. But interaction with, science fiction, right? Whatever, actually interacting with very sophisticated Android AI systems that had some psychological abilities that were actually superior to ours. And then with that, and there's the big question of nativism versus learning. So would that improve our abilities if we could somehow program it into AI systems and then, get it by interacting with them, or are we just stuck, are humans in long-term plateau of not really being able to get much better at our ordinary psychological abilities than what we've seemingly been at as long as we can remember. So. That strikes me as one other thing to think about, and I don't really know what Depends what abilities you want to.
Yeah.
Bring up.
Question? Yeah.
I tend to be a Pollyannish on these questions, but the idea of having a child raised by a philosophical zombie that had a very high level of sophisticated affective computing, so that it actually detected your emotions, communicated with you in an emotionally effective way, better than any human being could do, and yet it had no consciousness of its own. That does begin to get my Sherry Turkle technophobia going, you know? Maybe that's bad.
The ideal Bulgarian therapist as your parent?
Yes, exactly.
So I'll just point out your assumption that it's non-conscious would be based purely on what it's made out of. Right?
No, I actually do believe in a qualia thing. I believe it's possible.
But there are functionalists who think you can somehow get qualia out of functional states, in which case computers could have. Actually, as I had my students write papers on AI and consciousness, a number of them suggested that maybe even current AI systems have qualia. They're just going to be different than human qualia because they're made out of different stuff.
Well,
It's an interesting way to
If I
go.
could just throw one last thing in. Your your idea that functionalism suggests that you could have very low level intentionality in anything that would be the same as the
At a very abstract
intentionality at a
level.
higher level. It reminds me of the argument about panpsychism. Do you know about Tononi and information theory? The
Little bit.
idea that basically, if intelligence and consciousness is an emergent phenomenon of all matter, it's the degree of sophistication of the matter. Therefore, you could say that just in the same way that there's consciousness in every physical object on those grounds, you could say that any object that had any kind of intention to do X in the face of Y had the same kind of intentionality that you're looking for in functionalism. So even simple chemical catalyst reactions are a form of intentionality in matter that just scale up to the kind of conscious intentionality that we have. But maybe that's taking it too far.
Anybody else? Okay, well, let's say thanks to Larry and
Okay.
Thank you.